The rain fell steadily against the green canvas awning of the coffee shop at a measured rate of roughly 1/10 of an inch per hour, generating a soft, rhythmic patter across the stretched fabric. The outdoor air held at an even 58 degrees Fahrenheit, carrying the raw metallic scent of wet city asphalt mingled with the decomposing tannins of fallen oak and maple leaves along 4th Avenue. Miles kept his hands buried inside the deep pockets of his wool overcoat. His right thumb rested against the smooth plastic casing of his blue lighter, feeling the slight ribbed contour of the flint strike wheel. Beside him, standing barely 18 inches away, under the 6-foot overhang, the stranger in the charcoal trench coat stared out toward the street, exhaling a pale gray plume of tobacco smoke that drifted horizontally in the damp air. For nearly 2 full minutes, neither man produced a single word. The acoustic landscape between them was defined entirely by mechanical and natural ambient sounds, the low rumble of an underground R train vibrating through the sidewalk grates, the wet hiss of automobile tires passing at 20 miles per hour, and the occasional heavy drop of water splashing from the rusted metal corner of a second-story fire escape. From the edge of his peripheral vision, Miles tracked the stranger's steady, disciplined posture. The man stood approximately 6 feet 1 inch tall, his broad shoulders squared beneath the heavy weave of his dark trench coat. He held his unfiltered cigarette between the leather-gloved index and middle fingers of his right hand, lifting it to his lips at precise intervals of 12 seconds, never once checking his surroundings. On his left wrist, extending half an inch from beneath the dark cuff, sat a stainless steel mechanical field watch on an olive canvas strap. The man raised his arm, his eyes narrowing slightly as he checked the dial against the gray afternoon light. The sweep-second hand completed half a rotation before he lowered his arm back to his side with a subtle, controlled motion. When the glowing ember reached within a 1/4 inch of the paper filter, the stranger dropped the spent butt onto the wet concrete sidewalk. He brought down the heel of his right boot, rotating it 90 degrees clockwise with firm downward pressure to extinguish the remaining sparks. Without looking back toward the street or acknowledging Miles, he turned, gripped the heavy brass handle of the cafe entrance, and pushed the door inward. Miles stood alone under the green awning for another 30 seconds, taking one final draw of cool air before discarding his own cigarette into the perforated metal standing ashtray beside the brick facade. The wind from the north was beginning to gust at 7 miles per hour, driving cold mist beneath the canvas shelter. He turned up his coat collar, pressed down the brass latch, and stepped back into the coffee shop. The transition between the outdoor atmosphere and the interior climate was immediate. The ambient air inside the cafe was a humid 71 degrees Fahrenheit, saturated with the aromas of ground espresso beans, warm dairy, and damp wool. The low-frequency murmur of 12-seated patrons blended with the dull rhythmic thrum of the 2-group commercial espresso machine purging boiling water into its steel drip tray. Miles walked along the narrow perimeter aisle toward his designated seat in the corner, but his gaze remained locked on the back of the charcoal trench coat. The stranger did not veer toward the order counter to inspect the glass pastry display, nor did he scan the chalkboard menu. He walked with measured, unhurried strides down the center of the hardwood floor, keeping his eyes forward until he arrived directly at Table 4. Table 4 was the exact 24-inch round composite table that the woman in the olive knit sweater had vacated less than 8 minutes prior. The 16-ounce clear plastic cup containing her leftover iced cold brew still rested in the center, surrounded by a puddle of condensation that had spread to an oval roughly 4 inches wide. The 3 remaining ice cubes had melted down to thin slivers of floating slush. The man came to a complete halt 3 inches from the table edge. He did not sit down on the vacant bentwood chair. Instead, he unfastened the top 2 dark horn buttons of his trench coat, reached into his interior left breast pocket, and extracted an unbranded brass tumbler key. The key was looped through a 1x2-inch rectangular brown cardboard tag, bearing no visible handwriting on its outer surface. He held the brass key loosely between his bare fingers, staring down at the empty seat across the table, as if silently calculating the duration of an absence. His facial expression remained entirely static, revealing neither frustration nor relief. Miles slid quietly into his own wooden chair at table 7, 6 feet away. He kept his elbows tucked close to his torso to prevent the cast iron pedestal from rocking on its flattened matchbook shim. Resting his forearms against the table surface, he pretended to organize his papers, keeping his line of sight angled 30 degrees toward the stranger's hands. The man in the trench coat lowered his right hand and lightly touched the outer plastic rim of the cold brew cup. He held his fingertips against the plastic for 3 seconds, testing the residual coldness of the liquid to determine how recently the drink had been abandoned. Satisfied with the physical evidence, his eyes dropped toward the glossy interior design magazine resting on the edge of the tabletop. Protruding 3/4 of an inch from beneath the back cover of the magazine was a small, torn strip of thermal register paper. It measured approximately 2 inches in width and 3 inches in length. The stranger extended his thumb and index finger, pinched the exposed edge of the paper, and drew it smoothly out from under the magazine. Miles leaned forward a fraction of an inch, his breathing shallow. Across the torn surface of the white paper, illuminated beneath the 60-watt track lighting, were 2 lines of handwritten text. The letters were inscribed in a distinct, highly saturated blue oil-based ink, the exact formulation deposited by the fine point refill the woman had painstakingly assembled 30 minutes earlier. The man read the brief message without moving his lips. His jaw tightened momentarily, producing a subtle, rigid muscle contraction along his cheekbone that perfectly mirrored the tension Miles had observed during the woman's phone call. With a smooth, practiced economy of movement, the stranger slipped the paper note and the brass key into his deep coat pocket, smoothed his lapels, and turned toward the exit. He did not look at Miles. He did not look at the barista rinsing milk pitchers behind the counter. He walked along the exact line of floorboards he had used to enter, pushed open the heavy glass door, and stepped back out beneath the overcast Brooklyn sky, turning south along the wet sidewalk until his dark silhouette vanished among the passing umbrellas. Driven by an urgent creative reflex, Miles grabbed his 0.7-ounce mechanical drafting pencil and flipped to a fresh page on his 8.5 by 14-inch legal pad. His fingers moved with aggressive speed across the yellow paper, transcribing every detail of the sequence before the sensory impressions could fade. He documented the exact fabric density of the charcoal coat, the 3-second duration of the temperature test against the plastic cup, the dimensions of the cardboard key tag, the rigid angle of the man's jawline, and the precise trajectory of his departure through the door. For nearly 8 minutes, the graphite point scratched continuously against the paper fibers, filling 2 entire sheets with dense, unbroken prose. When his hand finally cramped, Miles laid the pencil flat on the table and leaned over the pad to evaluate his work. He read the text from the top of the first page, his eyes moving across the lines of graphite. A familiar, bitter dissatisfaction tightened in his chest. The writing was disastrously bad. It was stiff, pedantic, and thoroughly uninspired. In his attempt to capture the reality of the exchange, he had once again produced an exhaustive inventory of physical items in second-by-second movements that read like an insurance claim report or a police incident log. There was no literary atmosphere, no underlying psychological tension, and no emotional weight. Miles slumped back into the hard wooden chair, letting out a long, heavy exhale that stirred the loose edges of the notepad. He knew his technical shortcomings all too well, his compulsive habit of substituting cold physical measurements for genuine character insight. Yet he recognized that this failure was not solely due to poor technique. His concentration was entirely fractured by his own curiosity. He could not write an honest scene because he was hopelessly obsessed with deciphering the underlying reality. The scattered fragments of the woman's telephone conversation buzzed relentlessly inside his head. What was hidden in the 3.5-inch crawl space? Why had she instructed the caller to leave the key under a brick and refused to sign the documentation? Why was a formal citation issued on a Monday morning? And why had this man arrived precisely 8 minutes after her departure? The unresolved narrative hung in the air, like static electricity, paralyzing his ability to invent or dramatize. He was no longer working as a detached storyteller. He had become an impotent spectator trapped by an incomplete puzzle. You can't even describe a stranger picking up a piece of paper without making it sound like an autopsy report, he muttered to himself, rubbing his face with both hands in deep frustration. The dry, bitter scent of stale tobacco lingered on his skin. The interior of the cafe suddenly felt suffocating. The hum of the refrigeration units, the constant clatter of saucers, and the thick, humid aroma of warm milk pressed heavily against his temples. Deciding that remaining at this unstable table would only result in further creative failure, Miles made a swift decision to abandon the workspace. He stacked his 7 pages of observational notes, folded the yellow legal pad closed, and slid his 12-inch clear acrylic ruler into the internal pocket of his canvas shoulder bag. He gathered his pencil case, his scratch sheets, and his blue plastic lighter, packing everything away with hasty, decisive movements. He needed to leave the building, walk 5 or 6 blocks south along the perimeter of Prospect Park, and let the cold autumn air clear his congested thoughts. Miles stood up and pulled his heavy wool coat from the back of the chair, guiding his arms through the dark satin sleeves. He slung the canvas bag over his right shoulder and walked toward the entrance. But as his hand reached for the brass push bar of the door, his eyes caught the plate glass window. The weather had deteriorated significantly during the 8 minutes he had spent writing. The gentle mist had organized into a heavy diagonal sheet of cold rain, driven by 15-mile-per-hour gusts against the glass. Thick rivulets of water streamed down the exterior pane, distorting the headlights of the traffic on 4th Avenue. He recalled the damp chill that had penetrated his shirt cuffs during his smoke break under the awning. Wandering through a 40-degree Brooklyn downpour with a canvas bag full of unlaminated paper was completely impractical. His sudden burst of resolve collapsed into tired resignation. He unslung his bag, slipped out of his wool coat, and walked slowly back to table 7. As he sat down, he became acutely aware of his physical discomfort. His bladder was full, his lower back ached from sitting on the unpadded wooden chair, and his mouth tasted of cold acidity and ash. He needed to visit the restroom to splash cold water on his face. However, glancing down at his empty ceramic mug, a sharp wave of cafe self-consciousness arrested him. He checked the brass hands of the wall clock above the pastry counter, 2:54 p.m. He had occupied this prime corner seat for 2 hours and 40 minutes while consuming only a single $3 cup of black drip coffee. To walk past the staff to use their facilities without purchasing another item felt socially unacceptable. Miles stood up, reached into his trouser pocket, and pulled out a worn $5 bill. He walked to the counter, stepping up to the wooden register. When the barista finished drawing a portafilter and looked up, Miles ordered a second 12-ounce drip coffee of the house medium roast. He handed over the bill, received a single dollar bill and a quarter in change, and dropped the 25-cent coin directly into the acrylic tip jar. Leaving the fresh, steaming paper cup on his table to secure his seat, Miles turned and walked down the narrow, 3-foot-wide hallway leading toward the single-occupancy restroom at the rear of the building. The restroom was small and utilitarian, illuminated by a single bare 60-watt incandescent bulb that emitted a faint, high-frequency electrical buzz. Miles approached the porcelain sink, twisted the cold water handle 90 degrees, and waited 3 seconds for the water to drop in temperature. He cupped the icy flow in his palms and splashed his face 3 times, letting the cold shock clear the lethargy from his eyes. He pulled 2 rough brown paper towels from the metal dispenser, patted his skin dry, and smoothed back his damp hair in the mirror. Taking 3 deep, measured breaths to center his thoughts, he unlocked the deadbolt and pushed the wooden door open into the hallway. He walked back toward the illuminated main floor, rounding the corner by the coffee bean storage shelves. Miles stopped dead in his tracks. Standing at the front counter, waiting quietly behind a customer paying for an iced tea, was the tall man in the charcoal trench coat. His wool cap was now removed and tucked securely under his left arm, revealing short, dark graying hair combed neatly to the right. His heavy trench coat hung unbuttoned, its wool fabric darkened across the shoulders by fresh rainwater. He stood with his hands resting calmly in his coat pockets, looking up at the hanging menu board with steady, neutral focus. An abrupt jolt of adrenaline tightened in Miles's chest, instantly dissolving every trace of mental fatigue. The stranger had not departed the block. He had merely walked outside to verify the message, made a calculated decision, and returned to establish a position inside the room. Moving with deliberate silence, Miles slipped along the perimeter wall and settled back into his wooden chair at table 7. He drew his yellow legal pad from the canvas bag, positioned the clear ruler along the margin, and rested the graphite tip of his pencil on the top line of a clean sheet. Without blinking, he fixed his eyes on the man at the counter, ready to record every fraction of an inch.